This is gonna be a pretty difficult video to make for many reasons. I like to focus on positive things, even if I do it in a tongue-in-cheek manner. But when talking about crime in Sweden, things get complicated. Some people say that Sweden has become a crime-infested ghetto with gangs roaming the streets. And some people claim that Sweden is perfectly fine and all the sensationalist media reports are completely overblown. I want to have a closer look at what life in Sweden is really like these days. And I also want to have a look at some statistics to get to the bottom of how bad the situation in Sweden really is. I'll focus on sexual crimes and violent crimes in particular, because that's really what all the media is focusing on. So let's get started. Let's discuss the actual situation with crime in Sweden. First off, I'm gonna say something that will piss off a lot of people. I haven't seen a rise in crime in Sweden personally. I'm not affected by all the shootings and bombings and whatnot. So from a personal point of view, I would say that Sweden is still extremely safe, but it depends on a lot of factors. Where you live, for example. I live on the island of Kungsholmen, in an area that's blissfully spared from most violent crime. We have some break-ins and drunken people and general crime, of course, but it's not like I've ever seen anyone with a gun. The worst thing that's ever happened to anyone I know is that an ex-colleague was assaulted during his walk home. But that was over a decade ago, long before this crime epidemic that media are reporting about these days. So crime does happen, and it has happened. Sweden isn't a utopia where everyone is happy and holding hands and singing la-di-da-di-da. But the crime you read about in media doesn't happen everywhere. And you're unlikely to see any of it if you're visiting Sweden. You could even go to one of the so-called no-go zones and still feel pretty safe. I've talked about no-go zones in Stockholm in another video, but it's basically just areas with more unemployment, more immigrants, and more quote-unquote unwanted people. Comparing them to real no-go zones abroad is pretty ridiculous. But regardless of all of this, crime has increased in Sweden, and violent crime in particular. So let's have a look at some statistics. As you know, statistics can be twisted and turned, but I'm gonna do my best to try to stay as objective as possible. I have a feeling that this is gonna be an eye-opener for me as well as a lot of other people. Sweden started to record crime statistics in 1950, but there were changes to the system in the mid-1960s. There were also changes in 1974 and the early 1990s, so data from that long ago isn't really comparable. But we can still see that Sweden had an increase in homicide rates in the 1980s and early 1990s. And there was a massive increase in narcotics-related crime after 1980. But that's not the entire truth. That's also a time when there were changes to narcotics laws as well as changes to how to measure crime statistics. So in reality, there was likely an increase in narcotics-related crime because it was the 1980s, but the graph likely also shows a massively inflated figure. Likewise, if we look at violent crimes like robberies, there was a massive increase around 1950 to 1980. But again, there were tons of law changes, as well as changes to how to measure statistics during that time. So what does that really tell us? Not much, to be honest. I would guess that Sweden did become a bit more unsafe during that time. But I doubt that the actual change is correctly reflected by that graph. That's the danger when looking at statistics. If we want to find statistics to show that Sweden has become really dangerous, well, then we can definitely find data to support it. But it's extremely difficult to interpret the data correctly because laws change, measurement methods change, and society changes. Let's keep that in mind as we start looking at the period after 1990 in particular. we look at a graph of reported crimes from 1994 to recent times, that number has increased. Not super dramatically though, and the biggest increase seems to be between 2006 and 2008. That doesn't really correspond with media reports of gang crime in Sweden, does it? Because that started in the 2010s. Once again, statistics can be misleading. This graph shows the number of reported crimes, but not the actual number of crimes. First of all, as I mentioned, rules about how crime statistics are calculated change over time, so this graph could show too many crimes in recent years. Or too few. But also, it could be that people are simply reporting more crimes, and if that's the case, it's a good thing. More crimes reported means that people trust the judicial system and that they believe that the crimes will be cleared up. Swedes trust the government to a high degree after all, and Sweden ranks extremely well when it comes to corruption. As in there's low corruption, Sweden ranks extremely well, not high when it comes to corruption. I guess I do have to mention that despite all of this, Sweden's trust in the police has sunk immensely in recent years. It's actually a bit of a meme that it's no use reporting scams or petty crimes because the police will simply disregard all of those cases. But anyway, let's have a look at the types of crimes that are being reported. Oh my, now we're gonna get into some really messy topics. There are some positive things in this graph. The number of reported break-ins have decreased since the 1990s, and the number of reported traffic crimes have decreased massively as well. The number of robberies are pretty constant since the 1990s, so there's no major change there. But then we have some less positive things. I don't really know what happened with narcotics in the earlier parts of the graph. I can only speculate that it was yet one more law change, but either way, those crimes have still increased since the 2000s. And the number of reported frauds have also increased in the 2000s. I think that makes sense given how much easier it is to commit cyber fraud than doing it in person. But we also have some other worrying trends. The number of assault cases have increased, for example, and so have the number of homicides. And most significantly, the number of sexual crimes. I guess that there's no way to avoid the topic, so let's jump straight in. Is Sweden's reputation as the rape capital of Europe warranted, or is there some form of misrepresentation going on? Let's see how badly this video is gonna get flagged, because I'm gonna say the word rape quite a few times. The number of reported rapes per 100,000 people has steadily increased since the 1960s, with a massive jump in the mid-2000s. And that might be a good thing. No, wait, I didn't mean it like that. Sorry, let me explain. It's a good thing that people are reporting the crimes. And Sweden, along with other countries with a high level of gender equality, report more of those crimes than other countries. There is still a huge hidden statistic about sexual assault. It's one of those crimes that people find extremely shameful and difficult to report. But according to European studies, there's a clear correlation between the number of reported sexual crimes and equality. There might be, and it might even be likely, that there are other countries with more rapes, but the women don't report them for various reasons. Cultural norms, for example, they might not even realize that marital rape is actually a crime. And they might also not have faith in the judicial system. Will people take the crime seriously if they do report it? Or will they even end up in trouble if they report it? So a large number of reported sexual assaults is of course not a good thing, but it's good that people feel that they dare report them. So far I've just talked about reports though. Let's have a look at what happens after that. If you thought that I was gonna whip out some statistics to show that sexual assaults in Sweden aren't really all that bad, well then you guessed wrong. The number of convicted cases of sexual crimes still shows an upwards trend, unfortunately. So, is that it? Is all the fear-mongering actually true? Is Sweden the rape capital of Europe? As always, it's never that simple. The Swedish Council for Crime Prevention has analyzed the statistics and compared how laws are formulated in different countries. Swedish laws are quite strict compared to some countries, and each individual case of sexual assault is also reported as a separate crime. As a very crude example, if marital rape happens 10 times, then it will be reported as 10 separate crimes in Sweden, while it might be a single crime in another country. All in all, the Swedish Crime Prevention Agency estimates that Sweden lies basically in the middle of European statistics after balancing things out. Which is still not good, but it's not as miserable as some people paint it out to be. The number has increased though, even if it's not as sky-high as it might appear. And speaking of that, just recently there was actually a pretty famous rape case in Sweden. In 2024, a 16-year-old girl called Meja was raped in the town of Skellefteå. The case became an international sensation in 2025 because the man who did it was only sentenced to prison instead of deportation. The Court of Appeal ruled that the rape wasn't brutal or long enough to be classified as aggravated rape. And deportation can only be issued for major crimes, so they essentially decided that the man who did it can remain in Sweden. And people are quite upset about how this case has been phrased. So the rape wasn't long enough? How long is an acceptable rape in that case? But I think that people should read up on the case before they jump to conclusions. He absolutely deserves to be in prison, but compared to all the other brutal cases that also occur, I don't really see how this should be classified as aggravated. As for deportation, that's also a problem. Given the current laws in Sweden, he couldn't have been deported either way because of his refugee status. Politicians in Sweden are trying to change those laws though. Because it's pretty much undeniable that a lot of violent sexual crimes have been committed by immigrants and refugees. And it's possible, or even likely, that a big part of the increase in recent years is because of that. But keep in mind that that's just statistics. People are individuals, and there's always amazing people as well as complete trash in every culture. But speaking of law changes, I want to mention a pretty amusing but also slightly worrying change that happened in 2025. In order to battle the crime epidemic in Sweden, a new law has been issued to protect the police. Protect them against being made fun of, that is. If you call a police officer a rude word, you can now be prosecuted for it. It's intended to ensure the safety of the police, but it's also a worrying trend against freedom of speech, something that's vital for a democracy. Either way, the law came into effect on July 2nd, and by the start of September, there were 78 reports in western Sweden. Let me tell you some of the horrible things that Swedes have called the police, but I have to warn you, there's some strong language here. Whore, fake cop, gay, and bum. Cop bastard, pussy, and bearded four-eye pussy. Idiot, hobbit, dwarf, racist, as well as various slurs against foreigners. Disgusting little cop, fucking bad cop, and dork. Bitch, suck dick, and at least one case of I don't listen to women. And also one case when they said that the police officer was abusing their power. That's apparently also a rude thing to say. Now, a couple of these make perfect sense. Of course you can't call a police officer really insulting things. But I think that the dwarf and the hobbit ones are hilarious, and dork is just adorable. But calling out abuse of power shouldn't fall into this category, and people are worried that the police will misuse this new law. But thankfully, a lot of people have been acquitted. For example, a 20-year-old that yelled "police whores." The court decided that it wasn't meant to degrade the police officers, but rather an expression of their frustration and rage. So with a bit of luck, we won't see police officers booking people for calling them hobbits or dwarves in the future. No, but seriously, the police do need a bit of protection because they're going up against a lot of violent gang crime in Sweden. During the last 10 years, the number of people in Sweden who worry about crime have increased from 28% to 54%. And 25% feel unsafe walking in their neighborhood at night. In 2025, there's been shootings in Gävle, shootings in Gothenburg, shootings in Malmö, and of course, shootings in Stockholm. There's also been a lot of explosions and other violent crimes, and young people are still being recruited into gangs. But the number of shootings have actually gone down in 2025 compared to 2024. The number of explosions have gone up though, but despite that, the Netherlands has actually surpassed Sweden when it comes to number of explosive crimes. That's not really something to celebrate, but at least we're not worse anymore. No, but seriously, up until 2013, all the Nordic countries had a pretty much equal frequency of deadly crime. But Sweden has twice as much deadly crime as Norway right now. Some of this is because of honor crimes where women have been murdered because of religious or cultural reasons. But most of it is due to violent gang activities. The number of shootings in Sweden have gone down in 2025 compared to 2024, but the numbers are still pretty abysmal. In 2017, Sweden was comparable to southern Italy, and there were 4 or 5 times as many shootings in Sweden as in Germany. Statistics from 2013 also show that the number of shootings today are 5 times as many as they were 12 years ago. Between 2014 and 2017, Sweden was the second worst country in Europe when it comes to shootings, compared to 22 other countries. So there's really no denying that there's been, and there is, a lot of violent crime in Sweden. But what does that actually mean for people living here? Most of the violent crime in Sweden is due to organized crime or gangs. Sweden has made a lot of poor decisions in the last decades. Some people blame immigrants for everything, but that's just part of the puzzle. Crime happens when people lose hope, when they're poor, desperate, and outside of society. Sweden has a decent social safety net, but there's still a fair bit of relative poverty in the country. And even though education is free, there's still a lot of people lacking an education. But most of all, there's a lot of people who feel disillusioned and like there's little hope for the future. That's not unique to Sweden though, the whole world has had a bad decade or two lately. But Sweden has also struggled with a lot of immigration, segregation, and a refusal to deal with issues in time. The crime situation in Sweden is partly because organized crime and gangs have been allowed to grow without consequences. And they are the ones recruiting young people today, often disillusioned immigrants from disadvantaged areas. I grew up in the south of Stockholm, in the suburbs of Vårbygård and Skärholmen. And I imagine that kids in those areas are prime targets for gang recruiters today. But if you travel just a few minutes north from there, things look very differently. Likewise, if you travel just outside the so-called no-go zones of Rinkeby or Tensta. Swedish cities are still safe, and even the no-go zones are relatively safe. Not 100% safe, of course. There's a risk of violence everywhere, and there's even been explosions in central Stockholm. Innocent bystanders can always get hurt, even if most of the gang violence is directed at other gangs. But all of that crime is something I just don't see personally. I never see it outside of sensationalist reports in newspapers. But there's definitely been an increase, especially in certain types of crimes. Sweden is changing, and it's a rougher country now compared to just a couple of decades ago. Sweden isn't a crime-infested ghetto yet, but the increase in crime has been sudden and significant, and I think that that's why so many people are so surprised. But you don't have to be worried about visiting Sweden. And I hope that we manage to do something about this crime epidemic. It'll take time to change, but new laws are coming and change is hopefully coming. We'll never go back to the innocent times of good old Sweden if it ever really existed, but maybe we can still make the place just a bit safer for everyone. And that's about it for this look at the crime situation in Sweden. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.